Imagine working 60 hours a week to build $1 million empire, only to be fired because the chief executive officer's influencer daughter thought my style lacked sparkle. They believed taking my title meant taking my power, but they forgot one American truth: the one pouring the wine holds the secrets. Here is how I put on a busgirl's apron and legally evicted a billionaire brat from her own $500,000 gala. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Delilah Hudson. I am 34 years old, and until a crisp Tuesday morning in October, I was the undisputed creative engine behind Ethelgard Epicurean. If you have attended a high-end culinary event in Austin, Texas, within the last 5 years, you have tasted my work. I built that company's reputation from the ground up, trading my 20s and early 30s for 60-hour work weeks, endless tasting menus, and a contact list of the most demanding investors in the state. I crafted visceral, authentic dining experiences that wealthy patrons paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to attend. Then came the closed-door meeting. The conference room at Ethelgard was encased in heavy glass, offering a panoramic view of the Austin skyline, but that morning, the air inside felt entirely suffocating. Sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table was Julian, our chief executive officer. Julian was a man who possessed the remarkable corporate ability to fail upward, a figurehead who spent more time practicing his golf swing at the country club than reviewing our quarterly profit projections. Beside him sat his 23-year-old daughter, Savannah. I knew exactly why I was there the moment I saw her. Savannah was lounging in a leather chair, scrolling intensely through her phone, her long acrylic nails loudly tapping against the screen. She was the textbook definition of corporate nepotism, dressed in expensive designer clothing, someone whose entire understanding of the hospitality industry was curated through 15-second social media videos. Julian cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably and entirely unable to meet my eyes. "Delilah," he began, his voice dripping with forced, rehearsed sympathy. "We are restructuring the executive team. The board of directors feels Ethelgard needs a fresh, viral direction to stay competitive. We are letting you go. Effective immediately. Savannah will be stepping in to take over as the new creative director." I did not scream. I did not cry. In the corporate landscape of America, visible anger from a woman is immediately weaponized against her. Instead, I maintained a perfectly neutral expression and looked directly at Savannah. She finally put her phone face down on the table, offering me a smile that was entirely hollow and dripping with condescension. "No offense, Delilah," Savannah said, her vocal fry echoing sharply off the glass walls. "But your whole authentic, farm-to-table culinary style is just so terribly outdated. It is honestly boring. People do not want real food anymore. They want an aesthetic. I am taking Ethelgard into the future. We are pivoting to fully immersive, three-dimensional virtual reality dining experiences. Think holographic menus, neon lighting, and interactive content creation stations at every single table." It was an absolutely absurd business strategy. She was talking about replacing high-end, Michelin-quality catering with a cheap, flashing digital circus. But she had the right last name, and in Julian's world, family blood outweighed a solid decade of blood, sweat, and guaranteed profit. Julian hastily slid a thick manila folder across the polished table. "This is your severance package. It includes 6 months of standard pay, provided you sign the attached non-disclosure agreement." I opened the folder, scanned the cheap legal jargon, and laughed softly. The agreement essentially demanded I sign away my right to ever speak about my monumental contributions to Ethelgard, effectively erasing my legacy from the industry while they continued to profit off the foundation I built. "I will not be signing this," I stated clearly, pushing the folder back across the table. "My equity in this company remains fully intact, as per my original founding contract. You can take my office, Julian, but you cannot buy my silence for pennies. Julian's face flushed a deep crimson red, but he knew he had no legal ground to force my hand. I stood up, smoothed my black skirt, and walked out of the building with my head held high. I left with my shares, but I knew the harsh reality of my situation. My immediate career was effectively paralyzed. Julian's family held immense power and influence in the Austin business scene, and crossing them meant countless doors would close before I could even knock. The final bitter insult came exactly 2 hours after my security badge was deactivated. An automated company-wide email was sent out, proudly announcing Savannah as the brilliant visionary leading the upcoming Autumn Gala. The Autumn Gala was not just another dinner party, it was my masterpiece. It was a massive appreciation event for our largest and most critical investors, an event I had spent the last 7 months painstakingly designing down to the exact thread count of the linen napkins. Savannah had boldly stolen my magnum opus, planning to use my countless sleepless nights as the launchpad for her grand executive debut. Most people would have broken down right then. They would have gone to a local bar, cursed the unfairness of the universe, and updated their resumes through tears. I did not. I drove straight back to my downtown apartment, brewed a strong pot of black coffee, and sat down at my laptop. Savannah was incredibly arrogant, but more importantly, she was chronically lazy. I had watched her operate when she was merely an intern. She hated reading contracts. She despised tedious administrative details, and she made critical decisions based entirely on momentary impulses and social media trends. Now, she was about to manage an event with a budget of $500,000 with zero actual operational experience. I opened my private, encrypted database, pulled up the master vendor list I had created for the Autumn Gala, and began to hunt. I did not need to invent a weapon to destroy Savannah. I just needed to find the inevitable gap in her sloppy, impulsive preparation, plant myself exactly where she would never bother to look, and let her own staggering incompetence pull the trigger. It took exactly 48 hours to find the fatal fracture in the new management's foundation. While tracing the digital footprints of the upcoming Autumn Gala, I realized Savannah was pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into securing internet personalities and viral marketers. She was incredibly focused on who would be taking pictures at the event, but she had completely neglected the most fundamental rule of event planning. She had never actually signed the final lease agreement for the venue. The chosen location was the Obsidian Conservatory, a breathtaking, massive botanical greenhouse situated right on the rural outskirts of Austin. It was a structural masterpiece of wrought iron and towering glass panels, filled with exotic flora. However, behind its lush green aesthetics, the venue was bleeding money. The original owners were drowning in nearly $2 million of mounting operational debt. Savannah had placed a nominal holding deposit down weeks ago, assuming the space would just wait for her while she played executive. That assumption was her first unforced error. I did not hesitate. I immediately liquidated my entire 401k retirement account, draining every single cent I had saved over the last decade. But I knew my personal savings would not be enough to buy a commercial property of that magnitude. I needed heavy artillery. So, I made 3 highly confidential phone calls to a group of my oldest, most elite former clients. These were powerful, quiet billionaires who deeply despised Julian's flashy, incompetent business style and had only stayed with the catering company because of my personal oversight. When I pitched my strategy to them, they did not just laugh. They opened their checkbooks. Within 24 hours, using their silent financial backing and my completely emptied life savings, I established a blind shell company. I named it Vanguard Heritage. The actual acquisition felt like a high-stakes robbery executed in broad daylight. Over the course of 3 exhausting days, my newly hired legal team aggressively negotiated with the desperate owners of the greenhouse, because we offered a clean, all-cash buyout that would immediately erase their massive debt. They handed over the absolute ownership rights without a second thought. I bought the Obsidian Conservatory right out from under my former employer, and because Vanguard Heritage was heavily masked through corporate privacy laws, no one at my old company had any idea the title had changed hands. But owning the battlefield was only half the preparation. I needed an army. On the fourth morning, I drove out to the greenhouse and called an emergency, closed-door meeting with the existing operational staff. There were about 40 of them, ranging from veteran groundskeepers to the catering prep crew. They looked utterly terrified, fully expecting the new corporate owner to slash their jobs to maximize profit margins. Instead, I stood at the front of their break room, looked them in the eye, and made an offer they could not refuse. I am keeping every single one of you, I told them clearly. In fact, effective immediately, I am increasing all of your hourly wages by 50%, with guaranteed health benefits. Your jobs are entirely safe, but in return, I require absolute, unquestioning loyalty for a very specific private event we are hosting next month. The relief in that room was palpable. By treating the invisible working class with genuine respect and paying them what they were actually worth, I secured an ironclad wall of devotion. To them, I was not just a boss, I was their protector. With the venue secured and the staff fiercely loyal, it was time to bait the trap. As the new anonymous landlord, my shell company issued a mandatory, updated rental contract to Ethelgard Epicurean for the upcoming gala. I buried a highly unusual, extremely strict legal stipulation deep within page 17 of the document. I titled it the Service Dignity Clause. It explicitly stated that any verbal abuse, physical harassment, or demeaning behavior directed at the venue's staff by the renters or their guests would result in the immediate, non-negotiable termination of the event, total forfeiture of all deposits, and the legal eviction of the hosting party. I emailed the 40-page document directly to Savannah's office. A meticulous executive would have flagged the clause immediately and demanded a revision, but Savannah was not meticulous. She was impatient, arrogant, and allergic to reading fine print. Less than 2 hours after I sent the email, the digital contract bounced back to my inbox. It bore Savannah's flashy, stylized electronic signature right at the bottom. She had signed it blindly. She had just legally agreed to hand over complete authority of her $500,000 event to an anonymous landlord, completely unaware that she had handed the detonator directly to me. All the legal tripwires were securely fastened in the dark. Now, all I had to do was wait for the spoiled princess to walk right into the greenhouse and step on the landmine. The night of the autumn gala finally arrived, bringing with it a thick, suffocating Texas humidity. Standing in the shadows of the employee staging area, I watched as Savannah's so-called futuristic vision infected my beautiful property. The Obsidian Conservatory, once a sanctuary of natural moonlight and fragrant blooming orchids, had been violently transformed into a chaotic nightclub. Brutal, pulsing neon lights in hideous shades of artificial magenta and electric lime green slashed through the delicate ferns. The classic string quartet I usually hired had been replaced by a deafening electronic soundtrack that vibrated unpleasantly against the glass walls. And the food was a complete travesty. Instead of the rich, slow-roasted heritage meats and delicate local vegetables my clients expected, waiters were carrying out bizarre, tasteless cubes of three-dimensional printed synthetic proteins, smoking with dry ice to distract from their lack of flavor. It was a spectacular, incredibly expensive disaster, and I was going to watch it burn from the inside out. I did not attend the gala in a designer evening gown. I did not walk down the red carpet or pose for the flashing cameras of the local media. Instead, I stood in front of the cracked mirror in the staff locker room and systematically erased Delilah the executive. I scrubbed my face completely clean of expensive foundation and mascara. I pulled my hair back into a severe tight bun at the base of my neck. Finally, I traded my tailored silk blazer for the standard, poorly fitted black polyester uniform of a catering server. I tied a thick canvas apron around my waist, making sure the knot was tight. The moment I stepped out of the locker room and onto the floor, something magical happened. I completely vanished. In the eyes of the ultra-rich, service workers are not actually human beings. We are simply moving furniture. We are invisible hands meant to clear away dirty plates and refill crystal glasses without making a single sound. By stripping away the visual markers of wealth and authority, I became a ghost haunting my own creation. I moved silently through the crowded aisles, carrying a heavy silver tray of champagne flutes, completely ignored by the billionaires and tech magnates I used to negotiate with over closed-door lunches. This invisibility granted me absolute, unrestricted access, as I smoothly poured a glass of sparkling water for a powerful real estate mogul. I listened intently. "This is an absolute circus," the mogul muttered to his wife, his face twisted in deep disgust as he pushed a plate of glowing blue foam away from him. "Julian must be losing his mind putting that arrogant child in charge. I am pulling my funding on Monday morning. This is an insult to our time." His wife nodded, swatting away a thick cloud of artificial fog pumping from a machine near their feet. "It is entirely classless. I genuinely miss Delilah. She actually understood hospitality." I offered no reaction. I simply bowed my head, picked up the discarded plate, and melted back into the crowd. I heard similar brutal complaints echoing across the massive room. The wealthiest power players in the city were absolutely miserable, trapped in a neon nightmare, their anger quietly boiling over. While Savannah was busy taking selfies near the main entrance, completely oblivious to the impending financial ruin of her father's company, I was running the actual event from the shadows. I wore a tiny, flesh-colored earpiece hidden beneath my hair, connected to a discreet two-way radio clipped inside my apron pocket. Every 5 minutes, I whispered sharp, precise commands to the kitchen staff. "Fire the backup tenderloin for tables 5 through 12, I murmured into my collar, expertly dodging a stumbling influencer. "Keep the real wine flowing. Do not let anyone drink that synthetic garbage Savannah ordered. If they ask, tell them it is a special reserve." I was making absolutely sure that while the atmosphere and the creative direction were heavily criticized, the fundamental service and the secretly replaced food remained entirely flawless. When the inevitable explosion happened, I needed it fully documented that the venue staff performed perfectly. The entire weight of this failure had to crash squarely, undeniably onto Savannah's narrow shoulders. As the clock approached 9 at night, the tension in the room grew unbearably thick. It was time to position the final piece on the chessboard. I walked back into the bustling, brightly lit kitchen and approached the catering captain. I gently took the heavy silver serving tray from his hands. He looked at me, confused, but he did not argue with the woman who had just doubled his salary. I had deliberately manipulated the floor plan earlier that morning. I assigned myself the most dangerous, highly exposed section of the entire room. I balanced the heavy tray on my shoulder, pushed through the swinging double doors, and walked straight toward table number 1. This was the epicenter of power. Sitting around the massive circular table were Julian, Savannah, and the 3 most critical venture capitalists keeping the catering empire afloat. By walking up to that table to pour their water and clear their plates, I was stepping directly into the line of fire. I was a loaded weapon hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently for someone to pull the trigger. Approaching table number 1 was like stepping into a localized pressure cooker. The air was thick with the silent, mounting fury of the 3 most powerful venture capitalists in the state. They sat with their arms crossed, aggressively ignoring the plates of glowing synthetic appetizers in front of them. Julian sat between them, sweating profusely, attempting to salvage the evening with nervous, empty laughter that fooled absolutely no one. And then there was Savannah. She was completely oblivious to the financial catastrophe unfolding right beside her. She had a glowing ring light clipped to her phone, holding it at arm's length as she live-streamed the entire disaster to her thousands of followers. She dramatically pouted her lips into the camera lens, complaining loudly over the throbbing electronic music. "You guys, this lighting is literally giving me a headache," she whined into her phone, her shrill voice slicing through the heavy tension at the table. "I told the tech team I wanted an immersive cyberpunk aesthetic, but they are just totally ruining my vision. It is so hard being the only creative genius in the room. You know, one of the lead investors, a man who controlled over $50 million in capital, gripped his crystal water glass so tightly I thought it might shatter in his hand. I smoothly stepped forward, refilling his glass from a silver pitcher, keeping my eyes respectfully glued to the floor. I was close enough to smell the cheap, overpowering perfume Savannah had drenched herself in. The sheer entitlement radiating from her was suffocating. Suddenly, the screeching electronic music cut out with a violent, ear-piercing pop. Above us, the massive, expensive three-dimensional holographic projectors suspended from the greenhouse ceiling began to rapidly malfunction. The floating, rotating digital menus and the neon geometric shapes spiraled out of control. They flashed blindingly bright white, emitting a terrifying, high-pitched electrical squeal that made hundreds of guests cover their ears in agony. A sharp scent of burning wires and ozone flooded the botanical garden. Then, with a heavy mechanical clunk, the entire virtual reality system short-circuited and died completely. The room was plunged into an awkward, heavy dimness, illuminated only by the emergency track lighting and the faint glow of cell phone screens. Total, humiliating silence blanketed the venue. You could hear a pin drop across the massive room. The investors at table number 1 turned their furious gazes directly toward Savannah. Julian desperately tried to stand up to apologize, but Savannah beat him to it. The public embarrassment fractured her fragile ego instantly, and she panicked. She desperately needed a scapegoat to absorb the blame for her monumental failure. Her panicked eyes darted around the room and locked onto the closest target. It was Matteo. Matteo was a 62-year-old immigrant who had worked in the Austin hospitality industry for 4 decades. He was a dignified, soft-spoken man whose knees ached after double shifts, yet he never complained. He was walking toward the head table, carefully balancing a silver tray carrying 4 cups of steaming hot espresso. "You!" Savannah shrieked, pointing her perfectly manicured finger at his chest. Her voice echoed violently across the dead silent room. "What did you do? You tripped over the power cables. Did you not? You clumsy, stupid old man." Matteo froze, his eyes wide with confusion and terror. "No, miss," he stammered politely, his hands trembling slightly under the weight of the silver tray. "I was just bringing the coffee. I did not touch any cables." "Do not lie to me," she screamed, taking a threatening step toward him. The veneer of the glamorous executive had completely dissolved, revealing a cruel, vicious child throwing a tantrum. "You ruined my entire event. You ruined my vision. You people are all exactly the same, completely useless and incompetent." Without warning, Savannah slapped her hand hard against the bottom of Matteo's silver tray. The impact sent the heavy ceramic cups flying into the air. Boiling hot espresso splashed across Matteo's crisp white shirt and shattered violently against the marble floor, spraying dark liquid all over his polished black shoes. Several guests gasped in pure shock, but no one moved to intervene. The wealthy and powerful simply watched the abuse unfold, as if it were part of the evening's entertainment. Matteo stood there, trembling, his chin tucked down to his chest in deep humiliation. He did not defend himself. He knew the unspoken rules of his social class. The customer is always right, especially when the customer is a billionaire's daughter. "Look at this mess," Savannah roared, gesturing wildly to the brown puddles staining the pristine marble. "Clean it up, right now. Get down on your hands and knees and use your bare napkin to wipe up every single drop. You worthless idiot." The cruelty was so visceral, it made my stomach turn. Matteo slowly reached into his apron, pulled out his white cloth napkin, and began to bend his aching knees toward the floor. That was the exact moment the ghost decided to haunt the living. I stepped out from the shadows of the service station, moving with a terrifying, deliberate speed, before Matteo's knees could touch the cold stone. I forcefully inserted myself between him and Savannah. I planted my feet firmly, raised my heavy steel service boot, and violently kicked the fallen silver tray across the floor. It skidded with a loud, aggressive metallic screech that echoed like a gunshot through the silent conservatory. Savannah flinched backward, her eyes wide with shock at the sudden insubordination from a faceless uniform. I squared my shoulders, looked directly into her furious, spoiled eyes, and spoke one single word. My voice was not loud, but it was laced with absolute, razor-sharp authority that instantly froze the blood of every executive sitting at table number 1. No. For a moment, the single word hung in the humid air, heavier than the suffocating silence that had swallowed the room. Savannah stared at me, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the reality of a faceless worker defying a direct order. The shock quickly curdled into a rabid, unhinged fury. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure entitlement. "Excuse me," she shrieked, her voice cracking as it echoed off the glass walls. "Who do you think you are speaking to? I am the creative director of this company. You are absolutely nothing. Security. Someone get security in here right now. Grab this useless Busgirl, throw her out on the street, and call the police. I want her arrested for harassment and insubordination." She waved her arms frantically, gesturing toward the shadows where the hired guards usually stood, but not a single security officer stepped forward. They all remained perfectly still at the perimeter of the room. They knew exactly who signed their newly increased paychecks, and it was certainly not the screaming girl in the designer dress. At table number 1, the commotion finally pulled Julian from his panicked stupor. He pushed his chair back, preparing to pacify his daughter, but as he stood up, his gaze locked onto me. I had not moved an inch. I stood with my spine perfectly straight, my chin leveled, projecting an aura of absolute command that no canvas apron could ever hide. He saw the cold, familiar calculation in my eyes. He saw the woman who had built his empire from the ground up, the woman he had foolishly discarded just 30 days ago. All the blood instantly drained from Julian's face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. His jaw dropped, and he stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his seat. "Delilah," he choked out, the name barely a whisper. Yet it carried enough horror to make the 3 powerful investors sitting next to him snap their heads in my direction. I did not scream back at Savannah. I did not need to raise my voice to match her pathetic tantrum. Instead, I simply raised my right hand into the air and snapped my fingers once. It was a prearranged signal. Up in the glass control booth, my fiercely loyal technical director slammed his hand down on the master override switch. Instantly, the sickening, pulsating magenta and lime green neon lights that had plagued the greenhouse were violently killed. The room plunged into total darkness for exactly 2 seconds. Then, with a massive, booming electrical surge, the venue's original, magnificent crystal chandeliers roared to life. Brilliant. Warm golden light flooded the botanical garden, washing away the cheap nightclub aesthetic and illuminating the space with a blinding royal majesty. The sudden, intense illumination was positioned to spotlight exactly one location, table number 1. Savannah was caught dead center in the glaring light, looking completely disoriented and incredibly small. With slow, deliberate movements, I reached into the deep front pocket of my black apron. I did not pull out a notepad or a rag. I pulled out a thick, legally binding document, neatly folded. I gripped it with both hands and stepped directly into the circle of golden light. No longer a ghost, but the executioner. "Savannah," I said, my voice projecting clearly and effortlessly across the massive room, carrying enough ice to freeze the humid Texas air. "You are not calling security, because my security team does not take orders from guests, and you certainly will not be firing anyone tonight, because you hold absolutely no authority within these walls." I opened the document and held it up. The media photographers, who had been lingering near the entrance, immediately sensed the massive shift in power. The rapid, blinding flashes of their cameras began to fire, documenting every single second of the confrontation. 36 hours ago, I declared loudly, ensuring the venture capitalists heard every single syllable. "You digitally signed the finalized rental agreement for the Obsidian Conservatory because you were too lazy to read the fine print. You completely missed the service dignity clause located on page 17. That clause clearly states that any verbal abuse, physical harassment, or demeaning behavior directed at the venue staff by the renter will result in the immediate, non-negotiable termination of the event." I pointed a sharp finger down at the dark, steaming puddle of spilled espresso seeping into the expensive marble, then pointed directly at Matteo, who was now standing tall behind me, safely shielded by my presence. You just physically assaulted a senior staff member and attempted to force him to his knees for an electrical failure that your own incompetent production team caused. I continued, stepping closer to her, forcing her to shrink back against her father's table. That is a severe, undeniable violation of the contract you blindly signed. Savannah tried to speak, her lips trembling, but I cut her off with the sharp, merciless swing of a verbal blade. Therefore, as the primary stakeholder and chief executive of Vanguard Heritage, the legal corporation that owns this entire estate, I am officially executing my right to terminate your gala. Effective this exact second, your event is over, your massive deposit is entirely forfeited, and every single member of the Ethelgard Executive Board is now criminally trespassing on my private property. The entire room erupted into a symphony of shocked gasps. The wealthy elite of Austin whispered furiously among themselves. The venture capitalists sitting at the table stared at Julian with absolute disgust, realizing he had allowed his daughter to lease a venue from his sworn enemy without doing a single background check. Savannah's eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. "You cannot do this," she cried out, tears of sheer humiliation finally spilling over her heavy makeup. "My father is the chief executive officer. We rented this space. You are just a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin my night." "I am not ruining your night," I replied smoothly, leaning in so close she could see the absolute victory in my eyes. "I am simply enforcing the law. You wanted to run a company like a social media influencer, without reading the rules, without respecting the people who do the actual heavy lifting. You thought tearing off my title stripped me of my power, but out here in the real world, the landlord holds all the cards." I turned my back on her sobbing form and faced the silent, stunned crowd of investors and media personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, projecting total, undeniable dominance, "Ethelgard Epicurean no longer holds a valid lease for this premises. I must ask the host to immediately vacate the property, or my security detail will forcefully remove them for trespassing." The trap had snapped completely shut, crushing her fragile, unearned empire under the absolute weight of legal reality. Savannah desperately spun around, reaching her hands out toward the three venture capitalists sitting at the table. "You have to do something," she begged, her voice shrill and breaking. "Tell her she cannot do this. We are your partners. My father made you millions." The lead investor slowly stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored suit jacket. He did not look at Savannah. He looked down at Julian, who was still slumped in his chair, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his defeat. "We are not your partners anymore, Julian," the investor said, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. "We are exhausted by this circus. You handed the keys of a premium brand to a child who treats staff like garbage and feeds us glowing foam. We are entirely finished." The investor then turned to me, offering a sharp, respectful nod. It was the silent acknowledgement of one apex predator recognizing another. My display of absolute, ruthless authority had won them over completely. I gestured to the perimeter of the room, my security detail, a group of imposing men who had watched the entire debacle unfold with quiet satisfaction, moved in immediately. They flanked Julian and his daughter, their expressions hard and unyielding. "Escort them off my property," I instructed clearly, "and do not let them use the front lobby. Take them through the service exit." Savannah shrieked as a guard firmly grasped her arm, but her protests were entirely drowned out by the heavy silence of the room judging her. Julian finally stood up, his legs trembling so violently he could barely walk. They were marched away from the glittering chandeliers, forced to walk through the bustling kitchen. They passed the very staff members Savannah had just degraded, receiving nothing but cold, triumphant stares. I followed right behind them, stepping out into the humid, oppressive Texas night air. The service exit led to a bleak concrete loading dock lined with overflowing garbage dumpsters. This was the unglamorous reality of the hospitality industry, a fitting place for their exit. Julian stumbled toward his waiting luxury sedan, But I called out his name, forcing him to turn around. He looked pathetic, a hollow shell of the arrogant executive who had fired me 30 days ago. "Before you drive away, Julian," I said smoothly, stepping off the concrete dock and into the alleyway, "you need to understand exactly how deeply you lost tonight. Did you honestly believe those three-dimensional projectors just happened to malfunction by pure coincidence?" Julian blinked, his bloodshot eyes widening in confusion. "When you fired me, you forgot that my founding shares in your company were never revoked," I explained, relishing every single word. "I used the massive quarterly dividends from those very shares to make a secondary investment. Savannah chose a flashy, struggling tech startup to provide her holographic software. They were desperate for cash. So, I bought a controlling stake in their firm 48 hours ago." Julian gasped, taking a physical step back as if I had struck him. "There was no electrical short circuit tonight," I stated, delivering the final, fatal blow. "That was my technical director pushing a button to revoke your software license right in the middle of your event. I own the building, I own the technology, and as of 10 minutes ago, I own your entire client list. You have absolutely nothing left." I did not wait for his response. I turned around, walked back up the concrete steps, and let the heavy steel security door slam shut behind me, locking them out in the dark alley where they belonged. Stepping back into the bustling kitchen, I reached behind my waist and untied the rough canvas apron. I let it fall heavily to the tiled floor. I ran my hands through my tightly pulled hair, letting it cascade down my shoulders. I was no longer the invisible servant. I pushed through the swinging doors and walked back into the grand dining room. The elite crowd was still whispering frantically, but the moment I stepped onto the main stage and tapped the microphone, a hush fell over the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice warm and welcoming, completely devoid of the sharp edge I had used moments ago. "I sincerely apologize for the unpleasant interruption, but Vanguard Heritage believes in delivering exactly what you paid for. Therefore, I invite you all to take your seats and enjoy the real autumn gala." Right on cue. The kitchen doors burst open. Mateo proudly led a parade of 40 servers carrying massive silver platters. The hideous synthetic cubes were replaced with slow-roasted Wagyu beef, butter-poached lobster, and truffles imported directly from Italy. We poured vintage wine that had been secretly breathing in the back rooms for hours. The room erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause. By midnight, the atmosphere was electric. Venture capitalists and tech magnates were literally writing contract commitments on their linen napkins, eager to transition their accounts from Ethelgard to Vanguard Heritage. I had not just saved the event, I had successfully executed the greatest corporate acquisition in Austin's history. Hours later, the last guest finally departed. A soft, steady rain began to fall against the glass roof of the greenhouse. I stood alone inside my newly acquired executive office overlooking the empty parking lot. I poured myself a generous glass of real, expensive French champagne. I raised the crystal flute to my reflection in the dark glass, toasting the absolute ruin of those who tried to erase me, and cementing my reign as the undisputed new queen of the elite. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it, as an ad-free channel. Your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Boss Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.